What if the biggest mistake you'll ever make doesn't begin with bad intentions, but with one small compromise? Welcome to Life and Love by Design. I'm life and relationship coach Odette Coronel. Most of us like to believe that bad decisions are made by bad people, but what if that's not true? What if they're made by ordinary people under extraordinary pressure? Welcome back to Life and Love by Design. As a relationship coach, one of the things that I've learned is that we are rarely defined by the worst things that we've ever done. More often, we're defined by what we choose to do next. My guest today is Tom Hardin, formerly known as Tipper X. Tom is the author of the national best-selling book, Wired on Wall Street, which I read and I loved. And today he speaks around the world about ethics, decision-making, and the pressures that lead good people to make bad decisions. But, the reason that I wanted Tom to come on the show, and I highly recommend the book, so make sure you go get it, it's to explore the human side that's underneath the story. And then the impact that the choices that we make have on our relationships, on trust, on our identity, loyalty, marriage, all of that. So, Tom, welcome to Life and Love by Design. I'm so glad you're here.
It's a pleasure to be here, Odette. Thank you for having me.
So, first of all, Tom, tell us, who is Tipper X?
So Tipper X was my FBI code name going back about 15 years or so to 2008. I was the key informant in the largest insider trading investigation, I think, in U.S. history on Wall Street. Over 80 individuals were criminally charged with insider trading. If people aren't familiar, that's basically buying or selling stocks on information that's not public. And 81 people were arrested. There were 32 cooperators who helped the FBI build these cases. And I was the most prolific cooperator that entailed wearing a wire for 2 years to help the FBI build cases against some pretty powerful people in the industry. There's no excuses. I was a young professional working on Wall Street, trying to make it. And in my 20s, really sort of had this ambition, but with not a lot of guardrails, not really any great mentors. And it's not excuses. I always say I chose to cheat, and cheating is a choice. I crossed the line 4 times on 4 trades. And then that led to my cooperation, and the FBI invited me to speak about this experience in 2016. And from there, the FBI actually encouraged me to go share this story with companies and colleges and those types of institutions about how regular people could start crossing these lines and making bad decisions.
Right. Yeah. And it's interesting because I remember from your book, it was that one small decision where it's kind of ambiguous. Like, is it really a big deal? Is it not a big deal? And I find that that's how it usually happens, even when a marriage starts to break down or something else starts to break down. It's usually not that, like, we did this one huge thing and that's what happened. It always starts with crossing a small line or doing something that you think, it's a little white lie, or this really doesn't matter. But over time, that small decision kind of leads to the next and the next and the next. And that's what I noticed in your book. And it's so relatable because it kind of happens to all of us. And I think that in our culture, we tend to think of people in either good people or bad people, or heroes and villains, but really life is not so black and white, and it's not that simple. So looking back, do you think that you were like a good person that just made a bad decision? Or was there actually a time when you believed, when you kind of took on that identity of questioning, like, am I a bad person, or am I just did I do something wrong, a mistake? Did I make a mistake?
Yeah, it was very easy to get subsumed by the culture at that time in the industry. And so often, we'll tell ourselves, I'm a good person. Like, if I had read my future story back in college in a class on ethics or something, I would say, well, that Tipper X person would never be me because I'm a good guy. And sometimes I think whenever we feel like we would never cross a line, that's when we're more susceptible to letting our guardrails down. And one thing that happened in my career, my very, very short career, was at my final firm. My goals were first like picking stocks over like a 1 to 3 year horizon. And when we lost money, my boss came into my office and said, okay, now we have to start making money every month or we would not survive. So there was a big change in goals from, looking out longer term to now we have to have this short-term performance. And talk about my decisions. One of the decisions I made then was not to ask him, okay, are we going to stay within the legal guardrails or are we going to do what everybody else is doing or what we were telling ourselves? As a young man, that
Mhm.
young
Mhm.
professional, as the junior, I never asked those questions to my
Mhm.
boss. It was a very
Mhm.
ambiguous message:
Because
make
that was
money
the
every month.
culture of what
Exactly.
everyone was doing, so it was in that environment, it didn't seem wrong, it seemed kind of normal, it kinda seemed
Yeah. And when I actually got the tip on this trade, I told myself I was placing a very small trade. I use the language to kind of trick myself using euphemisms like I'm just taking a flyer. It's such an immaterial, small
Mhm.
stock trade compared to what everybody else is doing. So it's
Mhm.
very easy to sort of tell ourselves stories that I'm
Mm.
not doing it as bad as the other firm,
Mm.
right? Or the other
Right,
guy or whatever it is.
to
Yeah.
rationalize what you're doing and yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And so it happened 4 times that way where I would get a tip, place a small trade. My boss, I changed his name in the book, but he was never charged, but he definitely, was the closest thing I had to a mentor in all these 4 trades. He never asked me, what am I doing? He just looked the other way and
Mm.
basically said, don't tell me how you're doing this. So he was willfully blind. Like
Mm.
he knew what I was doing, but he didn't
Yeah.
question me, which further fueled those stories in my head. Okay, the first time I crossed the line, I wasn't fired. In fact, by the
Mm.
fourth trade, he said, good job, but don't tell me how you're doing it. So that further fueled the wheels of my head.
Wow, that's interesting. So he can kind of keep himself apart from it and not kind of be
Yeah.
the one that's doing it, but at the same time, he's in a way being complicit and almost encouraging you really by not calling it out and allowing it to happen because at the end of the day, he's your boss. Ultimately, he's responsible.
Yeah, that's right.
And
That's right. The plausible deniability. I think he was already setting
plausible
himself up for
deniability.
that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly. As I read your book and like I said, what really called to me was not the Wall Street part, which was really fascinating
Hmm.
because it was interesting just to learn about that world, but the humanness behind it. And I kept thinking about that sense that we all have that need to
Hmm.
belong, the
Yes.
belonging. And as human beings, I mean, we're wired to belong, right? That's why
Yeah.
people join gangs because they feel that they don't belong to
Right.
their families, right? It's that
Hmm.
innate desire that we all have. And looking back now, how much of it of your decision to do it that first time particularly,
Hmm.
how much of that was about that sense to belong or to be respected or to be viewed as successful or whatever it may be that was accepted and looked at in that environment?
Yeah, it's interesting because before I wrote the book, I'd been sharing the story for a couple of years, and I always told myself in like my keynote on the stage that it was a lot of pressure and pressure to perform, which is true. But as I wrote the book, and it's interesting, like my keynote is probably 8,000 words, and the book's 82,000 words, so you have to fill out a lot more detail in the book. And writing it last year, I realized, wow, this was so much about me wanting to belong in the in group, right? Every company or industry or group, gangs, there's an in group that has status.
Mm,
And as a young man, I think I was just almost blind to this idea that I was drowning in this insecurity because my competition that had the status was cheating to get ahead.
mhm,
And when I finally got the tip and I placed the trade and my boss looks the other way, as we talked about, it was more about having status at that point and being part of the in group rather than the money, because I shared in the book, on these 4 trades, I personally made $46,000. And not saying that's not any money, but in terms of somebody's career,
right.
throwing my career away at
It's not
29,
worth that, yeah.
it's not worth it in terms of the opportunity cost of never being able to work again in that, especially in that line of work. But to me, it was about not belonging or not feeling, sort of my whole life I shared going to this Ivy League college where nobody from my high school ever did that, and getting onto Wall Street and getting into hedge funds. Like I
Mhm,
always kind of felt like an outsider, like I was Tom from Georgia, middle class family, and now I'm at this Ivy League school, and I always felt like an outsider. And when I finally got into the in group in the industry, and I told them about I had one of those trades that they had. One of the guys in the in group said, "Oh, you don't do this stuff, Tom. This is us." I said, "Well, I know about another one coming." And he put his hand on my shoulder and said, "No, now you're one of us." So for me as a young man,
Mm,
gosh, the
wow.
desire to belong was really like subconsciously the reason I was engaging in this, just enough to feel like I belong, not doing it as bad as the other people I told myself that, but just to belong.
Right. Yeah. I have a mentor who says, the opposite of belonging is fitting in. And
Mm,
it sounds like you were actually trying to fit in.
but then, yeah, no, that's a great
Right.
reframe. Right.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And, tied to belonging is shame.
Yes.
So there's shame after we do something that we feel is not aligned with our values and our principles. And there's also shame beforehand because there's a shame of not fitting in or not belonging.
Hmm.
Do you think that the shame for you started before or after making that decision, or was it a little bit of both?
I think for me, it was more like it was after because it was so pronounced after, whereas before, I love the idea of not fitting in or wanting to fit in versus belong because I wanted to keep if I was thinking about the difference, well, I don't really want to belong because these guys are clearly doing something wrong but they had status, so I want to fit in with them. And so I want to do
Right.
it my own way, small trades. But there wasn't, the way it was so drastic after being caught and having to go through years of not being able to work, which I shared, and going through that shame, that was just so much more magnified than not having the status before. Whereas going through the shame spiral for years, and the hardest part was not being able to work. And again, nobody should cry for me. These are my own decisions, my own choices. Nobody did this to me. But the consequences were something I never even thought about in terms of applying for jobs and that type of thing. And so that shame, whereas, shame is I tell myself I'm a terrible person who did the wrong thing. Whereas guilt, and I know, Brene Brown talks about this, guilt is maybe I'm a regular person, but I can use this bad thing to figure out what to do with my life, which is kind of what I've been doing the last 10 years. But shame versus guilt was something I was tangled up in for years, thinking they were the same thing.
Right. It's very difficult to kind of separate the identity from the behavior or the action.
Yeah, that's right.
How were you able to do that to kind of just make that distinction? Because I'm sure that it was a journey, it was a process to get there.
I have to give credit to Sue, my wife. She stayed with me, and 85% of marriages are going to end in this situation, and she chose to stay, and she didn't have to choose to stay. And there's probably situations where it's right for the
Yes,
spouse to leave.
you said
So
that on page. I have it. I have it. I have like notes here. I think yeah, yeah, I totally marked that down because I thought that was,
yeah.
yeah, amazing.
So she kind of helped me through that. I never saw a therapist or a psychiatrist or psychologist. Like, I talked to Sue and I talked to my priest, for confession, which is a great sacrament as a Catholic to be able to just get all that stuff off your chest. But the shame and the guilt, like, it stayed with me until I started speaking. The FBI invited me to speak about this, which is what put me on this path. And I was speaking at this conference for these financial people, and the event planner, she saw it. She's like, people gave you good remarks. They liked it, but they also said you're not well, and we want the audience to always feel like the speaker as well. And I said, well, what do you mean? She said, you're dealing with a lot of shame and guilt, and you need to lose the shame because it's not going to help you at all if you're going to continue to share this story and relive it every week
Mhm.
for people. But the guilt is going to keep you going. So I didn't really realize it until it was said
Mhm.
explicitly to me by an event planner at a
Right.
conference.
Well, what was your intention in doing the speeches? What did you want your audience to kind of gain from it or feel?
Yeah, it was almost like in a way it was selfish. In a way, it was my therapy just to
Mm.
go out there and talk about it in a
Kinda
room
get it
where I
off
didn't
your
know
chest and
anybody, get it off my chest. And
yeah.
eventually, I did it for free for a year at colleges, and eventually people started paying me for it. So thank God I was able to sort of make lemonade out of lemons. But my goal was to really be of service too. Maybe somebody would hear this story and see themselves in it and not make these decisions. And the service part of this started before speaking. It was just, again, coming back to my wife Sue saying, why don't you go volunteer at the church and get outside your head? Because oh, that I was reading all these self-help books and they were not helping me because they made me think about myself. And so she's like, why don't you be of
Yeah.
service and get outside your head
Right.
and
It's
go to
not just
church and help?
reading, it's taking the action is what's gonna make the difference, right?
Yeah.
It's you
Yeah,
can
that's
read
right.
it, you can gain the insight, but it really takes action to actually, like, change things and feel differently. So
Yeah.
Sue's
So
smart,
being
she's
of
a smart
service.
cookie, yeah, she was yeah,
Yeah. She's like,
she was
just go
smart to
volunteer at
encourage you to
church.
go
I'm
volunteer,
applying
yeah.
for jobs. Yeah. I can't get, nobody's going to hire me. You check the box. And so go volunteer. And then once you are being of service for people in need, there was the big, the Haitian earthquake was interesting because that earthquake happened the day my
Mm,
name became public to the press. And then years later, I'm helping with the clothing drive, and it just puts things in perspective. I always tell people,
right.
if you're going through a hard time, just go volunteer and you'll put
Yeah.
yourself in perspective. So
See other
being of
people's
service started
problem.
before.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So being of service started before ever being on the stage. But, I spoke at the FBI and they said, go do this. Easier said than done. And then just speaking to students at these colleges I mentioned in the book where they saw themselves in me, and I thought, wow, if I could just stop one person in the audience from taking that first small step we talked about before across that line, then there's
Mhm.
something of value here. Otherwise, most people in my situation would never talk about this. Like, who would want to
Right.
go around and talk about the worst thing you ever did to strangers,
Right.
right? Not many people would, but I felt there's some
Exactly.
value in it.
Exactly, exactly. I wanna come back to something that I noted in the book, and I think it's really powerful. You say on page 213, you say, "Trust had become a currency I traded in, not something I lived by." And you said, "Loyalty felt
Yeah.
like an outdated ideal as I coaxed confessions from men who believed I was on their side." Wow, that's really
Yeah.
powerful. When you wrote those words, what were you realizing about yourself just in the process of just writing your words and thinking back to that moment when you have these men in front of you?
As I thought through it and relived it last year, writing the book was in its own way reliving it in a different way because of all the detail of I was sharing, and on stage I get to share the highlights, but not the details in the book. And so people know the FBI approaches me on the street. They say don't talk to a lawyer, so I didn't even talk to a lawyer for 2 years, which is
Which is
crazy.
crazy. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
crazy.
yeah. Anybody that watches Law and Order knows, like, you don't say anything
Always
to law
talk to a
enforcement.
lawyer. Absolutely.
Like, even if you did nothing wrong, you just talk to a lawyer first.
Talk to a
Exactly.
lawyer. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's one takeaway. And so they had me in a surreal situation, like wearing a body wire, and I was having to build relationships with these men. So it wasn't like, and I hope people can see that I drew a line when it got to two friends. Some people read the book, oh, this guy's a rat. Like I get that, but I tried to figure out how do I protect these two friends who I thought were good men
Mm,
and help bring the FBI, who I thought were the worst actors. But once
mm,
I got really good at doing this, and I have this whole framework in the book about timing the silence in the conversation, reflecting. Once I got really good at it, I thought, oh my God, am I doing the right thing by actually getting people to incriminate themselves? I mean, almost
yeah.
entrapping people in
Right.
talking about a crime they committed. So that's what I meant by
Mm,
the loyalty and the trust. Like I became looking at myself like, not was it worse than the trades, but maybe like was it another wrong decision to even be doing this? And it's very complicated,
yeah.
being in this situation.
Yeah, there's another passage where you described, sitting across from the men who trusted you and knowing that they had wives, that they had children, that they had families waiting at home. And then it brings to mind, again, when we talk about loyalty, loyalty to the people, or is it loyalty to your principles, or where does that loyalty lie?
I
It's
think as I was doing this, it was really loyalty to my two friends. I called them Peter and Todd in the book, who I was willing to do anything, I think, for the FBI to hopefully protect those two guys who I just knew better than anybody else. And not to say, as I said, that the other men were not good people. I just didn't know them as well, and I felt that they were worse actors.
Mhm.
But a lot of them had families, as I said, and was I getting them on tape to eventually have to be approached like me, and would they be in my situation or worse, just arrested? So there was sort of loyalty to Peter and Todd. Like I was going to do whatever it took to protect them, and eventually it worked out where I drew the line there when the FBI kept asking me to wear this wire, and I eventually had a lawyer. I said, I'm done doing this. And then the FBI, threw my name out to the press, which was a tough day, but that's the way I
Mm.
thought about it. And being loyal to my wife, she was going to stay with me at least up to that point, which, 85% of marriages don't. And so what was going to be the best outcome for her in our marriage? was I felt to
Mhm.
talk to, to follow the FBI's orders, but I could see where people might read it and say, "Oh, this guy's a rat," which I understand, but it was a tough situation.
Mhm. Yeah. One thing I liked about your book also was that you don't just tell your story, but you acknowledge other people's stories, like the collateral kind of damage, and you talk about, the cost isn't just financial, or it's not just in terms of money, but it's really, family or reputation, marriage, friendships. Who do you think, or which aspect paid the biggest price, do you think?
It's probably a tie between my family, just Sue having to she had to work. I couldn't find work, and she was at a company, Lehman Brothers, that went under, and she's on a 1 or 2 hour commute every day because she had to work. She had no choice. So I think she paid a huge price, and also, my reputation was destroyed. And so I wrote in the book about this idea of the integrity gap, where people are always concerned about your reputation and often not your character. And if you're so
Mhm.
concerned about what other people think about you and not focused on your daily decisions, you can have a massive gap, which I did as a young man. I fully admit that.
Mhm.
So I think it was a balance of both. Like the collateral damage you mentioned, like when I crossed the line 4 times, I never thought 10 years later, I wouldn't be able to coach my daughter's soccer team because I had to check a box. So it's not
Mm.
something that you consider back, when you make these decisions sometimes.
Right. Right. Wow. Right, it's long lasting, so it's consequence that
Yeah,
we don't even realize at the time could happen.
that's right. And there is research, like if you have literally like a picture of your, we didn't have kids, at the time, but you have a picture of your family on your desk at work. It actually, there's research that shows that you start to make decisions where you think beyond just that decision in the moment. You start to think more holistically because you have a family. And I think we were just recently married. We didn't have kids yet. Not that that's an excuse, but I wasn't really, there wasn't really like me contemplative thinking about this decision to cross the line, thinking about a family because they weren't,
Yeah.
the kids weren't born yet.
That's interesting that you say that. Just this morning, I was having a conversation with my daughter, Olivia, just about, I don't even know what we're talking, making decisions. And I said to her, like, when you have kids, it's almost like, when you're a kid, your parents are almost like your conscience, and you don't want to disappoint your parents.
Mm-hmm.
So you try to think and make your choices, based on it. Am I going to disappoint them, or am I going to get in trouble?
Mm-hmm.
And then once you have kids, it's almost like your kids take the place of your parents. And you're like, okay, I need to
Mm-hmm.
be a good example for my children, or I need to be a good role model, or how is this going to impact them? So it's interesting that you say that. I was just talking about that this morning, and it's so true. When you have kids, you have to, there's another level that you kind of think about, like, how is that going to, anything that we do, we think, how is this going to impact them? So,
Yeah, it's always hard to rerun, like, what could have happened when I got the first phone call, the first tip. But if the woman I mentioned who called me, if I just had a picture, on the desk, maybe I would have just glanced at it and said, "Hey, this isn't really worth it. It's not even worth making a small trade because
right,
I have a family now." But that didn't even cross my mind at the time. It was more about the belonging, we discussed.
right. Yeah. As you mentioned today, and as you mentioned in your book, approximately 85% of marriages don't survive what your wife experienced, but yours did, which is like amazing. Kudos to Sue and to the relationship that you have with her.
Yeah.
What do you think it was that made the difference? What did your wife see in you that, allowed her to stay and to, stand by your side and support you when you guys weren't really married that long? So it wouldn't have
Yeah.
been crazy for her to decide to walk away. So what do you think was the difference?
Yeah, it's interesting, because last year, again, as I was writing the book and had to get to the 82,000 words, I had to interview Sue, my wife, and it's pretty surreal if you're writing your memoir to interview your spouse. And I said, I have to fill some words out here. What was it like for you? Tell me about how you processed this. I mean, we talked about it, but I was so focused on myself at the time. Oh my God, it's my name on the front page of the newspaper, and it's my reputation. I was feeling guilty that I did think about her. And so I said, Sue, what was it like for you? And she said, thanks for asking, Tom, because you never did. And, she was right.
Mm,
Um, so I'm like, wow, it was really, the whole time through this, I couldn't tell anybody but her. And so the FBI, crazy story in the book, how they approached me on the street in New York City. That was a Tuesday morning. And they said I could only tell my wife and nobody else about this cooperation.
That
So
must
I
have been
waited till
first of all, that must
yeah.
have been so terrifying. I think
Yeah.
I would have had a heart attack, I
Yeah.
think. Yeah, that must have been
The
really
approach was
terrifying for you.
crazy on the street, and so, they don't I don't know if I wrote this, but I say it in my talk. They don't call you and say, "Hey, it's the FBI. Could you call us back?" They know your routine. They look at you,
Mhm.
and because they want to flip you, and
Right.
so they knew my routine. Approached me on the street Tuesday morning and said, "You can only tell your
Which
wife."
is
Of
so
course,
scary because they've been following you.
yeah,
They've been keeping track
exactly,
of you.
exactly.
So
They
that's
knew my
yeah.
nephew's name. They knew
Wow.
so many details about my private life because they want to show,
Mm.
"Hey, we're onto you." And
Right.
so they're like, "Can you tell? You can only talk to your wife about this, nobody else." So easier said than done. And I wrote in the book, I violated that. Like I went to confession at St. Patrick's and I
Mhm.
had gallows humor, like how many other hedge fund people are in line, confession. But the FBI must have been busy. But I knew I had to tell her. And so I waited till Friday after work, young couple, how was your week? And having a glass of wine before dinner. And, she had been working at this firm, Lehman Brothers, that went under. So she was having a
Mm.
heck of a time at work.
Right.
And I said, let me go first. And I said, you got to sit down. And I told her everything. And she said, can you say that again? I wasn't expecting that. And I said it again. And she paused. It felt like an hour. It was a few minutes. And she said, well, you didn't do anything to hurt me. And,
Hmm.
most, and as I interviewed her last year, I'm like, why did you say that? And she's like, I was almost thinking, Tom, that I was going to talk about having an affair or something, which she would have taken worse. And not that it was just like, oh, just some insider trading. That's not what she meant, but like,
Yeah.
she
But
took it that way, that I didn't do anything to hurt her, even though she would be collateral damage as my wife, as we talked about.
mhm. That's interesting. That's interesting. So it's almost not that she was relieved, but it was not
Right.
personally done to her. She didn't take it personal, like, oh, he did this to me. He did this. It's going to impact me, but he didn't do it to me. So in
Yeah.
a way, it was not something you did. It wasn't a betrayal in that sense. Whereas if it was an affair or something else, it was literally done to her.
Yeah. And,
Yeah.
and to her credit, because, it was a betrayal of our trust. She married this up and coming hedge fund analyst, not the insider trader. So she could have rightly said,
Yeah.
what, you were breaking the law? And like, I had no idea. And I thought I married somebody else. And that's not who you are. I mean, she would have had the right to say that, but to her credit, all this time going through this, like she never once, threw it in my face. And that's her grace and it's hers. And I don't get to take credit for it. Right. But she was owed a lot of anger. She mostly didn't take. And I've come to think that that's the thing I owe her and not a thing I earned.
Hmm. Wow. That's amazing. How do you think that this experience has changed you as a husband? And I mean, as a father, but you weren't a father at the time,
Yeah.
but just made you maybe a even better father, but really as a husband, how has it changed you?
It's interesting now. Like I guess our line of communication is better. I'd like to think, um, I'm not sure if I wrote about this in the book, but in my talks, I talk about what would have stopped me from making that first trade. And, I told myself I was a good guy. I can cross lines. We can all rationalize. But if I had been vocalizing my rationalizations with somebody else and maybe her at the time, even said, you won't believe, everybody's doing this. I got this tip. I'm thinking about making a small trade. She would have slapped me around. And so I kicked myself for just not saying it to her. Hey, what do you think? She would have slapped me
Yeah.
around and said, why would you ever do that? You're a good guy. You're going to great career path here. You would never cross the line. It would have been very easy for me to, it was very easy for me to override my own rationalizations. It's very hard if you vocalize it. So I think today, as we make decisions, financial or whatever, I'm much better about vocalizing things that we're thinking about and things that I might be rationalizing to her rather than like not having that conversation. And so she actually appreciated, she said, the day I confessed to her about the FBI, that I had no excuses. And I said, hey, I made these 4 trades. I did this. Like, we're not going to try to go to trial or try to craft a story that many other people might do in my situation, that I owned it. And she always said, Tom, you got us into this. You're going to get us out of it. And she had much more faith than I did. We bought the house in Westwood on double income. Like, she was just like, you're going to figure it out, which was a tough for years to be able to try to do that. But she had so much faith.
Yeah. Do you think that that made the difference in you being able to kind of get through this period? Is you kind of sometimes when we don't believe in ourselves or we just don't think we
Mm-hmm.
can make it through, we kind of have to borrow other people's belief in us, other people's faith because we don't have it ourselves. That I trust you and I believe in you, so I'm going to borrow your strength and your faith in me pretty much. Do you think that that's what got you through this?
Yeah, 100%. And I would hate to think like if she had left me like, 85% of marriages in, like what it would have been very dark for me. And so the fact that she was going to stay and also just be sort of my therapist. I mean, all that I was putting on here was not just the crimes. It was like, I'm a stay-at-home dad. And I wrote that section. I wish I had taken more pride as a stay-at-home parent. Like I just sort of had my ego and my identity as the hedge fund guy and not, picking up messes at home. And so I wish I got better at that. She said, just be the best stay-at-home dad you could be. And then, I got the good homemaker routine, taking care of the girls, cooking, that type of thing. So she just said, do that and be the best dad you can be. And then, go volunteer and be the best volunteer you can be. And then get into marathon running. I got into some crazy running races, but she supported that because it gave me structure to my day. I couldn't work, but I could get up and train for these marathons and crazy races I was
Mm.
doing.
Yeah.
And she supported it the whole time. And she said, you're going to figure it out. And I think she is of probably closer to her faith than I am. And she's always said, God has a plan. Like, there's a reason the FBI stopped you after 4 trades. You probably would have kept going. Maybe it's a good thing they stopped you. I'm like, I didn't even think about it that way, but
Right.
she's
Yeah.
right. And
Maybe it would have been even worse. Yeah. If they didn't stop you.
and
God
that's a great
forbid.
question I can
Yeah.
sometimes get. Like, what if it was 4 trades a year for 5 years, 20 trades? I'm probably going to prison for a long time. What if they
Right.
did me a favor by stopping me? And then she said that, God has a plan. And then, oh my gosh, they called me out of the blue in 2016 to speak. And so I think he does have a plan. And like her faith was
Mm.
just unbelievable. So I
Wow.
fed off of that to your question. Yeah.
Right. You mentioned the marathon running, and
Yeah.
I remember reading about that. And what was it that the marathon running represented for you? What
It
was
was
that?
just the way to get out of bed and set the alarm and have a training, a marathon training plan. You have to get so many runs in per week. You have to train. So it was just having structure to my day and having a purpose to wake up beyond, providing for the kids, which is a lot, at those ages, but just having a reason to get up and get fit and all that, but really just have a reason to exist. Because I, just not being able to work or not the kind of work I was looking for. Um, just having structure to my day was important, but I also overdid it. And I think sometimes, I don't know if it's just like endurance sports or people that really in the Ironmans and things like this, like we can put all of our eggs in that basket and it can take from other baskets in our life. And so whenever Sue wanted to have a really serious conversation about our future, we bought this house on double income. We were losing, our savings were going down pretty fast because I had to find a job. And I said, I have to go for a run. I have to train for this crazy 100-mile race I wrote about in the book. Like I was using it as a crutch almost, like, oh, I'm training
Mm.
for these races. I can't have this really important conversation with my wife.
Right.
And
Right.
then she still extended me the grace to be able to train for these races and run 100 miles. Um, and so that helped me get through the fog of this or just have some meaning, because she could see I was getting meaning from these races.
Right. It gave you a reason to get up in the morning pretty much, and something to
Yeah,
focus on
pretty
and have a
much.
routine
Right.
and just put all of your energy in that.
Right.
That's great.
Yeah. I mean, I was downloading like Olympic marathon training plans thinking I'd make
Yeah.
the Olympics. She's sort
I
of like,
know.
well,
It
see
sounded
what
kind of
happens.
excessive, it
Yeah, it
sounded kind of,
was. It
and
was.
I mean, I'm not sure if this is true for you or resonates, but it almost reminded me, like in reading a little bit about, when people, there's that cult, that one cult where they're priests, I think, and they hit themselves on certain times of day, and they kind of like the
Yeah.
self-punishing and
Yeah.
self-punishing.
Da
It was
Vinci
like,
Code.
because
Right.
it sounded kind of grueling. You know what I mean? Like it's the marathon running, it's great, but it's also can be excessive. And it get to that
Yeah.
point where it's like, it's almost punishing in a
And
sense.
there was some of that with that 100-mile race around the 1 mile loop. There was some part of me that wanted self punishment, which is not a healthy part of this, but
Right.
that I need to be punished. And I described in the race, things start to break down and it's not good, like health, like for health,
Right.
it
Yeah.
was way overdone. And having rhabdo and all that go through my body was not great. But I was also seeking some type of punishment beyond the marathon, which was, again, I think still part of the shame and guilt spiral I was in.
Right. So where do you think you are at when it comes to forgiveness? And do you think that
Mm.
you have gotten to a point where you have kind of truly forgiven yourself, or have you just kind of learned to accept and learn to live with what happened? Where are you at with that, do you think?
I think like the hardest part of anybody going through a failure, or maybe mine, like a public failure where it's self inflicted, like you have to own it. Like, yes, I made these decisions, and that's step one. I wrote in the book, like I used to call my bad decisions mistakes because it helped me not own them. And like, no, like I made bad decisions, and then owning it is the first step. Like you have to get outside your own bubble. And I was at home and not reaching out to friends and family, and you figure out who your true friends are pretty quickly. I don't recommend going through something like this, but I should have reached out to people sooner and got outside my own head, and I stayed in this shame spiral. And the hardest part of maybe overcoming a failure like this, you mentioned it, is the self forgiveness. And that took years, I think, just not being able to fully forgive myself because there's still consequences again for checking a box every once in a while. Like my oldest daughter was applying to Catholic school, and it came up, and I talked through it with the people there, and they were fine with it, especially with the work I'm doing today. But I didn't want my actions to impact my children. But that's something that always comes up, and I'm like, oh, I'm terrible, and at this point, it's sort of like a thought that comes into my head. It's a dark thought, but I know I can identify it as just a thought, a passing thought. It's going to pass, and that's much better for me. So it comes in from time to time, and then it leaves
Mhm.
because I can call it a thought and not
Mhm.
my identity, and that's actually helped a
Yes.
lot with self forgiveness. And I think you mentioned, what do you do with this? Like, not what happened in the past, but I have to have like a windshield mentality, not a rear view mentality. Like I have to just look forward, and part of me is like, should I continue to share this story on the stage? Is that helping me as a PTSD? But when I get the feedback, and especially now I'm old enough that the next generation is starting their careers and starting in the colleges, like when they resonate with it and email me or say, this part of the story is something I'm always going to remember in my life. Like I feel like, okay, there's good coming from this. And that's actually helped me a lot to say, people are not judging me for this. They're actually taking the lessons from it that they can apply, to the next generation.
Right. Yeah. And going back to when you mentioned that in the beginning when you first started giving the speeches that
Mm-hmm.
you were told the audience was like, "He's not okay." And I asked you,
Mm-hmm.
"What do you want them to feel?" The reason I asked you is because when I read your book and even in hearing you speak, I see this as a story of redemption, really.
Mm-hmm.
It's inspiring in a way because we are all faced with difficult decisions and we all are can we cross the line? Do we cross the line? Do we not cross the line? And and then once we do that, it doesn't have to be what defines you, but what comes next. So in your speeches and just in reading your book, it really is about redemption. It's this
Right.
happened and this is what I learned from it. And this is why I am more aligned today. I'm putting words in your mouth, but this is what I got from it.
Yeah.
I'm more aligned today
Yeah.
with my own, values and more in integrity maybe than I was before as a result of my bad decisions.
Yeah. There's a lot of positives. I mean, from what happened in terms of, my relationship with my daughters as a stay-at-home dad for years, we're very close. And so that's, father-daughter relationship is really important. But also like understanding, there's a lot that we don't understand in our 20s that we all understand in our 40s and 50s. That's just life. But like for me going through this, it's really acute in terms of like having no values, or just like in my 20s, I'm just worried about how much money I'm going to make every year, and like not really having a value system and what's important for me. Now I have that. And I would say sometimes I get the question, like, how did I bounce back? And, I thought about that a lot. And I would almost say like the redemption arc for me is not bouncing back. It's like rebuilding slowly. It's almost like a bricklayer where you're not bouncing a basketball. You're just sort of going out there with these talks in my life. Like you're just trying to lay one brick a day, tell the truth, show up for
Mhm.
family, be useful to somebody, whether it's a client or somebody else, who doesn't
Mhm.
even know my name. And I would say like the strange grace of it is that the life I ended up with is almost better than the one I was breaking rules to get.
Right. And every single decision that we make, that you make, that I make, it's just you're able to now make better decisions, and it's one decision at a time still today,
Still to this
even
day.
though you have the wisdom, right? Which comes in
Yeah,
hindsight,
that's
of
right.
course, but that's
That's right.
okay.
Yeah.
It's still we're always just making a decision, making a choice. And I mean, that's what being human is all about. And
Yeah.
I just want to bring up uh, that you mentioned that you're Catholic. I'm Catholic as well. I mean, I don't go to church every Sunday, but I am Catholic. And if you think about what the religion teaches us is about forgiveness, is that we all
Hmm.
make every single human being makes mistakes. And by taking accountability, which is what really confession is all about. It's you don't have to I'm not saying everyone should go to the church and confess to a priest, but that's essentially what it's about. It's about saying it out loud, taking accountability, accepting the penance, and then sin no more again, pretty much is what the priest tells us, right? You're forgiven, sin no
Yeah.
more. So it's you can be forgiven. In a way, our religion teaches us that it's okay. Not that it's okay to make the mistakes, but that it's also human to do those things and that we all deserve forgiveness.
Yeah, that's right. I wish the secular world had its own version of a confession. It's such a great sacrament. And I came into the church as an Episcopalian without so going through RCIA for my wife. And accountability is like the most important thing. And sometimes people conflate like responsibility and accountability. Like responsibility can be delegated, accountability cannot be delegated. Like it comes back to the person, and it's all about like ownership. And sometimes people think about accountability as punishment, where it's really just like, if I make this decision, am I willing to be held accountable? And I speak to all these companies, and anybody listening that works at a company, you have to sign a code of conduct. And the code of conducts all have these questions like, ask yourself, if I'm at that line, ask yourself all these questions. All the questions can be deleted. Just ask yourself the one question: if I make that decision, am I willing to be held accountable? And that's the bottom line.
That's the bottom line. Absolutely. I'm going to ask you a couple of rapid fire questions or the words, and I want you to complete the sentence.
Sure.
So the first one is
Trust is everything.
belonging is,
Belonging is overrated.
forgiveness is,
Forgiveness is essential.
the biggest lie people tell themselves is,
The biggest lie people tell themselves is, I would never cross the line.
hmm, love requires,
Love requires unfiltered communication.
and then the last one decision can change.
One decision can change your life.
Cool. I'm going to share my answers because I did this rapid fire to myself too.
Okay.
I'm going to tell you what I said. So I wrote, and I just literally wrote down the first thing that came to my mind. Trust is tested and earned. Loyalty is a choice. I had integrity here also. I'm not sure if I asked you about integrity, but integrity is being aligned with your values and your authentic self. Belonging is the opposite of fitting in. Forgiveness is a gift you give yourself. The biggest lie people tell themselves is that they would never do something, which is pretty much what you said. Love requires commitment and a decision to trust. One decision can change what you believe about yourself. If somebody is listening today, Tom, and maybe they're carrying some shame because of maybe not insider trading, but maybe something that they did that they wish they wouldn't have done or that they regret, or maybe it's an affair or a financial mistake, or maybe even, like addiction or something, and they wish they could take it back. What would you want them to hear?
You are not your worst decision or your worst mistake, or whatever it is. You are what you decide to do about that. And whatever your past is, like your past can't define you without you letting it do that. So, without your consent, your past cannot define you without your consent.
Yeah. And where can people find you, or where can people buy your book? I got mine on Amazon.
Wherever books are sold, Wired on Wall Street is the name. Wiley. There's hardcover, there's Kindle, and there's actually an audio book with a voice actor. I decided to go with a voice actor
Oh, okay.
because my family voted for him 3-1. So
You don't want to do the
He sounded
voiceover
much better.
yourself.
Yeah, it's 9 hours of talking, I'm told. So.
Oh, wow. Well, I really want to thank you for, coming on my podcast and sharing your story, not just here with me, but even for writing the book, because I'm sure that it was difficult to kind of revisit some of those chapters. But as I said before, I really think that it really is about, it's not just about the facts that happened. It's everything that you've done since then, and then that journey that you've been on all these years. And I think it's actually quite inspiring because no one is immune from being faced with those difficult decisions. We all face those, each and every day. And it's really about accountability, growth, resilience, and, the possibility of redemption. So again, I want to thank you for being here and for trusting us and the work that you're still doing. And I think it's helped people really understand, the pressure that we sometimes feel, that need for belonging, and how those things are very human moments that impact our lives and impact our choices. So it's truly been an honor having you here and speaking with you, Tom. And for listeners today, please buy the book, subscribe to this podcast if you're not already subscribed. Leave us your comments. Let us know what you think. And remember that your life and your love are yours to design. If today's episode described you or your relationship, then this is your moment. You don't need more information. You need a new way of living, choosing, and relating. And that's the work I do with individuals and couples. If you're ready to stop repeating the same patterns and start designing your life and relationships intentionally, visit the link in the show notes and book a complimentary relationship and life audit. Remember, your life and your love are yours to design.